Welcome, everyone. We are back in the Leadership Lounge, where we embark on a journey for better leadership. It's not about arrival, there is no destination. This is all about getting better and better each day for the people that we serve in search of that shared vision. Today, our episode is entitled Leading with Heart Without Losing Authority. And we have a special guest. Her name is Shenelle B. I'm going to introduce her in just a second, but I just wanted to announce that I have a different wardrobe on today because it's Founders Day. When it airs, it won't be Founders Day, but today is Founders Day. And I got to give a shout out to my 22 illustrious founders. Thank you for creating this organization that has lasted impact until today. Shout out Trenton Alumni Chapter and the first 44 Chosen Dynasty. Without further ado, Shenelle, I'm going to read her bio because Shenelle and I have very similar background, and I'm so excited that we always get to just sit and chat with one another. Shenelle is a former educator turned organizational strategist and transformational coach with over a decade of experience helping companies and institutions embed equity into their people practices. Throughout her career, she has walked alongside global companies and countless professionals, providing a strategic, heart led, and healing centered approach to growth and change. Rooted in her industry expertise, lived experience, and Bronx upbringing, we all know where we're from, has a heavy influence. Shenelle is known for disrupting with purpose and leading with intention. She skillfully navigates systematic challenges, advocates for lasting change, and creates spaces where people feel seen and empowered. Whether coaching individuals or driving broader cultural transformation, her mission remains the same to help people evolve, empower, and lead with heart. Shenelle, say hello to everyone.
Oh, hey, how y'all doing? So
Now,
happy to be here.
so happy to have you here. Is there anything that you want to add about, your why, your purpose, how you got started, what your specific leadership philosophy is?
Yeah, absolutely. I can certainly start with just my leadership philosophy. So I approach leadership as an inside out practice. So I truly believe that in order to be an effective leader, you have to be internally grounded. You have to be able to self manage. And then externally, that gives you or puts you in a position for relational responsibility. So I explore how unexamined fear, so things like failure, loss of self, loss of control, really shape individual behavior, team dynamics, leadership cultures, and organizational systems. So for me, leadership is not about managing people or enforcing outcomes. It's really about how we manage ourselves in relationship to others, especially under pressure or in times of uncertainty, volatility, and change. So regulation, clarity of values, and the ability to really lean into that discomfort to create environments of trust and accountability is really what drives that sustainable performance in the workplace and outside.
And I love that you said, it's not just managing people because people manager is a term that we use that's a little bit more progressive and inclusive than where we typically
Started.
talked about leadership. Because before it was just right outcomes. You were driving to those outcomes and didn't necessarily put people as a priority, right? People were
Mhm.
just the means to get to the outcomes, so we didn't necessarily prioritize. So I find it very intriguing that you said is not really about that, it's more so about inside. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the simplicity of it is that we all have lived experiences that shape the way that we lead, love, and connect in any given space. And the reality is in the workplace, yes, performance is part of it, but in order for us to perform and reach those outcomes, it requires connection in relation to others. So when you think about an environment like the workplace, it's a bunch of different lived experiences all coming together and they're shaping these teams, these cultural norms. And the reality is, if we don't know how to mix those different lived experiences and interactions, it has the potential to create the separation. It has the potential to create the disconnection. And I would offer that that's kind of what we're living through now, where you have so many teams and leaders who don't know what to do. They don't know how to get their teams to be engaged. They don't know how to get their teams to perform or see the value in the work. And I think that that's where it's important for us to understand where we're showing up with and what we may be bringing to the table that creates that disconnection and choosing to address it, even though it's uncomfortable. I think in this work, I've learned that a lot of times we run away from things that are uncomfortable for us. But the reality is now we're at a point where you have to think about, well, what am I sacrificing if I don't lean into this discomfort?
In leading, us being able to manage each other's differences, especially because there are so many, like, the systems that were created was to keep folks uniform.
Hmm.
Right, so now that we are moving towards this space where we're embracing each other's differences, where in a moment it's always feels easier at least to deal with people who think like you, right? Talk like you,
Absolutely.
desire the same things you desire, because then that reduces conflict.
Hmm.
So say that leadership is about managing those differences. When in your leadership career did you like really embrace that and understand that? Because that's not how we were brought up.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a great call out. And I would say it happened for me pretty early in my career because in my first role as a people manager, it was a very results driven environment. So I was in a contact center where we were responsible for very specific metrics. And when I took on the team that I was managing, I didn't necessarily understand like why they weren't performing, specifically because I was previously in the role. So it's like, yeah, this is a walk in the park. Like, what's going on? And it wasn't until I took the time to really have those one-on-one conversations to understand what drove the people on my team. What was the disconnect between their ability to do the job and executing these specific metrics? And of course, those metrics varied by employee, right? Like some people did certain things really well, other people struggled in other areas. But really being intentional about taking the time to understand what drove them really helped to motivate them to perform. And then the other piece that it illuminated is what was missing. So for some, it was very much, well, I didn't know this is what was expected of me to this degree. Or the previous leader made me feel like I couldn't share with them that I didn't understand how to do this. So as a result, I just operated in autopilot to avoid getting in trouble or to avoid having the customers get upset with me. So it was very much just walking them through the process and offering them some guidance. But the core of it is I wasn't able to do that unless I set that foundation of communication and transparency.
Yeah, and that's such an important point, because so much of what it appears as though many leaders are searching for is compliance, right?
Mhm,
They right, when you say it out loud, we know that, oh, no, that's compliance isn't as great as its intention or purpose. However, our practices, our systems that are in place seem to garner more compliance because it's so uniform.
yeah.
Whereas you said, "Oh, when I took a step back, I got the opportunity to see what each individual needed, how I could motivate them, where their strengths were." Right? But that takes a lot more work than having a blanket statement, "Everybody does this, and this is what I should get from everyone." So that brings us to this thought of authority. And I
Mhm.
often say that so many folks get authority and control detrimentally. You think about the difference between authority and control. What would you say? How would you
Well, I
explain?
would probably offer that one drives the other. Right? So a lot of times authority is the output of our need for control. So we think that we can motivate people by having control over how they behave, how they perform, the narratives or results that come from said performance. And the reality is that that's oftentimes rooted in fear. And nobody wants to say that, right? Because we've been so separated from our emotional experience that we don't sit with the fact that we are afraid of something when we try to impose our beliefs or our ideas in any context onto someone else. It's just that in the workplace, it's very much like hey, we're going to say this is my management style and my preference as a leader in the way that we communicate and the way that we perform. And oftentimes it enforces those conditioned beliefs around compliance. So, if we're leading from a heart centered, transparent place and really want to build trust, that requires a certain level of vulnerability on our side to be honest with ourselves. Nobody's saying you have to tell your team that this is what you're afraid of, but just having that self awareness shifts the entire conversation, shifts the entire interaction. And again, as I said earlier, we just have to be more open to leaning into that discomfort in order to be able to create the environments and teams that we really want.
And, as a former educator, we're both former educators. We saw that in the classroom too. So at one point when folks did evaluations, if you went into the room and it was quiet and kids were sitting with their hands crossed
Mhm.
or pencil in hand, just looking at the board, they didn't have to be cognitively engaged in a thing. It looked like you had that class under control. And teachers and many times were reluctant to include activities that could possibly make way for losing said control,
Yeah.
regardless of whether the kids were learning or not. If they looked like they were orderly, right? If they were compliant, and in many cases that was deemed a good classroom.
Yeah.
And we know how false that is now. Sometimes that, right, organized chaos, as we like to call it,
That part.
allow for additional learning, and it's the same thing, and nothing changes, it's the same thing in our leadership and in our teams. I often, when I'm working with teams and I see over compliance,
Hmm.
I start to question, A, how sustainable, like, what is it that they're really reaching for? How growth ready is this team?
Yeah.
When I see over compliance, to me, that's a red flag. Red
Yeah.
flag. Have you seen that in some of the, teams that you've worked with?
Yeah, absolutely. Where it's very much, it feels like a regime. And I think you hit on it earlier, where it's very much just like that's the way that we've been taught to perform at work. It's very much, these are the rules, follow them, or these will be the repercussions. And I think what we're realizing now is that we're losing the humanity in that, right? Because the reality is people are stressed and they don't know how to deal with that stress. And instead of us holding space for those folks to be able to find the clarity that would help them to perform, even if it is within specific guardrails, it's being missed out on because the expectation is still compliance. It's very linear, and there needs to be an incorporation or a balance, if you will, of that humanity, that humanness that really lets people know that it's okay to be stressed right now. It's okay to feel like this work is heavy in this moment. And we are a team that can get through this together. Like that is what people are looking for as a foundation to be able to continue to do the work that they do and do it well.
Right, because, we know, like, leadership, we learn it like it's clean, but in reality, it's very messy,
It
right?
is.
So and then when these times come or uncertainty or that causes us to pivot or completely abandon something that we were working on before, when we're not ready and trusting in our spaces, those teams typically have a very difficult time, if not the fact that that thing cripples that team or that company, that organization
Yep.
during that time. You and I talked a little bit offline because we just chat.
We
We
real
go
life
over this
friends.
stuff. Yeah, yeah, real life, we do this. So, when we were chatting offline, I wanna lift something that we talked about before, is about where this fear is even coming from, right? So,
Mm,
we've been touching on it, um, a little bit throughout this episode, but this fear is right, it's A, is intentional. It was set because if I can control you if you're fearful, you're easier to control, you're easier to comply and be obedient when there's said fear. And we talked a little bit about how our systems were crafted masterfully,
mm,
right, for this fear to sow dissension so that we don't focus on our individual genius because then that would make it difficult for us to be controlled.
mhm.
You wanna talk a little bit about that?
Whew. I mean, do we have the time, right? Like, I feel like it's one of those topics that you could spend so much time digging into because it's so deep. But I think what you summarized is exactly it, where as leaders, it's oftentimes easier. Like, I think that's one of the things that we've talked about throughout this conversation as a through line is just it's easier to lead with the path of less resistance, right? So if you already know that this is a method that has worked in the corporate environment for X amount of years, why change it? And what I would offer to the people who feel that way is, well, is it working? Right? Like we're now in a space where emotions, there's so much heaviness happening outside of the workplace that it is funneling its way into the workplace. And if there's one thing I know through the work that I've been doing is that from a psychological and neurological perspective, when your brain is constantly in a state of survival, it isn't able to function with clarity. And if you don't have clarity, how are you showing up for yourself? How are you showing up in the workplace? And how are you able to make decisions that impact an organization that are effective and sustainable, right? So if we don't take the time to find that grounding, if we don't take the time to understand our internal experience and how that impacts the relationships around us, particularly in the workplace, then it's a recipe for disaster, right? It's just not sustainable. Companies are not going to be able to innovate. They're not going to be able to scale. So, ultimately we just have to take a step back. I love saying to people, bring back the power of the pause to think about what's happening around us. Because, going back to your point about some of those systems that we've been basically born into, they teach us that we should just keep running. We're just going constantly. There's never a pause to think about why we're making the decisions that we're making, how they're going to impact the people around us, how they're going to impact the work that we're doing. So again, just contributing to that lack of clarity. So if we really are looking for that, it's up to us to be a little bit more present in our individual experience so that we can create that space to lead to that broader progressive change that we're looking for.
Yeah, and it's so cyclical what you were just lifting for us because you talked about what it does to a leader, any person to be in a constant state of stress,
Mhm,
but being more reluctant or feeling as though I don't have the time to take a step back or right, we just got to get this done now. I got to solve this problem right now, puts you in that perpetual state because
mhm.
like you said, the reason why it's not sustainable is because you are probably solving a problem for right now.
Yeah,
It's more like a Band-Aid. This wound is getting out of control, but you keep just dressing or treating what's right here in front of you, which doesn't allow us to be forward thinking, giving ourselves the space and grace to be forward thinking. I used to always say, as a leader, we need to identify what we're sacrificing and then be okay. Because in order to, especially when you've been in a perpetual state
mhm,
of high stress, right? Problem solving. People say, I've been putting out fires all day. If you're a leader saying that, this episode will probably benefit you. Um, because when we're in that constant state of putting out fires where we cannot be forward thinking. So
mhm.
if we don't take a step back and say, okay, this is what's going to be sacrificed. What's gonna be the impact of that,
Yep.
right? How are we gonna be able to address that later? If we don't take a step back and do that, we're never gonna get out that cycle because it's always about right.
Correct. Yeah, and I think you bring up a really strong point around like we have to separate ourselves from urgency culture, right? Like it's not a badge of honor for us to be overworked. Like on no level is that sustainable for our physical or mental being. So I think there's something to be said about how we separate that idea in the context of leadership, especially because as leaders, people are looking to us to set the tone for how we should be operating. So when we talk about the ripples of leadership and that team dynamic, a lot of it is driven by what we've been told is the norm. And I think we're at a point now where we have to say, like, well, first of all, what are those norms? Because there's a lot of them that exist that keep us in that fear cycle that need to just be lifted and shifted out of the picture, right? But nobody wants to talk about that because then it's like, well, if we don't do this, then what's the alternative? And what I would offer to those folks is that it's leading with vulnerability. It's the humanity, taking the time to set those clear expectations, but also being okay with not getting it right and not being able to do it all. The beautiful thing about the human experience is that we lean on each other to be able to make progress. So connection is only going to benefit us. It doesn't make us less than, it doesn't change our ability to do good work. It just gives us an opportunity to deepen our connection and relation with one another so that we can make meaningful change, whether that's in or outside of the workplace. And I think that so many people are afraid of just owning that imperfection, which
Yeah.
is kind of ironic if you think about it. Like, as humans, if there's one thing I know, and I say this all the time, we are imperfect beings. So the sooner we accept that, the easier it becomes for us to have some of these uncomfortable conversations and relinquish the control of thinking that we have to be perfect in the workplace and on our teams and so on and so forth.
And I think that you stated that so beautifully. And we are designed to be in community, like literally, biologically, socially designed
Hmm.
to be in community with one another. And like you said, we have this app to try to get it right because we don't want to rely on one another. So we are acting in direct conflict of our design.
That control, because when we realize it, then it becomes, well, who am I without this control? That's too risky.
Right.
That's too
Ooh,
scary.
ooh, that's good. That right there, who am I with that is such a good question. Who am I without the control? Ooh, that's deep. That's a good one to reflect on. I think after this episode, I'm gonna sit and reflect on that as well. Who am I without control? Because one thing that Chanel and I talk about often is that although we teach in this work, lead in this work, we're human as well, right? So this stuff comes up for us too. We're not free of control,
Right.
right? Control slips up and pops up in our lives. I mean, I know that we have language to be able to identify and take a step back, like you said, but that mug still show up. So I'm going to reflect on that, and I challenge the listeners to reflect on that question. Who are you without control? Oh, I feel like that's going to open up some doors for me. This is a good place to stop and reflect. Sit with this question. Who am I without control? And part two will continue on January 20th. See you then.